elderly woman saves a lion cub from drowning. You won't believe what happens next. In the vast, unforgiving African savanna, where danger lurks at every corner, an unexpected hero emerged. It was an ordinary day, and an elderly woman, known for her gentle heart and unyielding courage, was about to face an extraordinary challenge. A lion cub, barely able to stay afloat, was caught in the swift current of a nearby river. His life was hanging by a thread. But what happened next is something you'll have to see to believe. Get ready for a story of resilience, compassion, and an unbreakable bond between human and animal. Before we dive in, make sure to hit that subscribe button, like this video, and turn on notifications. We're bringing you more incredible stories, just like this one. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and leave a like. Share it with someone who believes in the power of courage and kindness. Let's spread this message of hope to those who need it the most. Per Gunter A.O. ChatGPT, the African savanna is a place where life and death are often separated by mere seconds. Vast, dusty plains stretch endlessly, dotted with the occasional acacia tree, and the sound of wildlife fills the air. The sun beats down relentlessly, casting shadows over the creatures that call this land home. Yet, in the midst of this unforgiving wilderness, one woman would soon find herself in the middle of a life-or-death moment she never expected. Her name was Ruth, a woman in her early 70s, with silver hair pulled back into a neat bun and eyes that sparkled with the wisdom of someone who had lived through decades of hardship and joy. She had spent much of her life in this rural African village, working as a volunteer at the local animal rescue center. Ruth's love for animals was unmatched. She had always felt an inexplicable bond with them, a deep understanding that transcended words. Over the years, her gentle hands had nurtured countless injured creatures back to health, from gazelles to elephants, always finding ways to help even the most vulnerable of creatures. It was a hot afternoon when Ruth set off to check on the rescue animals by the river. She had heard rumors of a lion cub spotted nearby, but nothing prepared her for what awaited. As she walked, the sound of the river grew louder, and with it, a strange tension seemed to rise in the air. Ruth quickened her pace, feeling an unsettling sense of urgency. She wasn't sure why, but something told her today was going to be different. When she reached the riverbank, her heart stopped. A small lion cub, barely larger than a house cat, was struggling in the fast-moving water. His little paws flailed helplessly as the current pulled him farther away from shore. The young cub was terrified, his wide, panicked eyes locked onto Ruth, as if he understood that she was his only chance at survival. But there was no one else around, and the river was too swift for anyone to safely cross without a plan. Without thinking, Ruth's instincts kicked in. She had no time to lose. The sun beat down mercilessly, and the cub's cries echoed through the air. Ruth glanced around desperately. She wasn't a young woman anymore, but she'd lived through enough battles, both with nature and within herself, to know that fear couldn't win now. The animal's life was in her hands. Ruth rushed to the edge of the water, her heart racing. She had no tools, no ropes, nothing but her old hands and a determination that had served her throughout her life. She waded into the river, its cold water reaching up to her knees. The current was strong, but she pressed forward. Every step felt like an impossible effort, the weight of the water pushing back against her, trying to pull her under. But Ruth kept going. As she neared the cub, the panic in his eyes grew. He couldn't swim much longer. His little body was starting to tire, and his legs were giving way to exhaustion. Ruth's heart broke at the sight, but she couldn't stop now. She reached out, her fingers brushing against the cub's fur, just as he was swept further downstream. She lunged, her hand grasping the cub's scruff just as the current tried to take him away. She pulled him toward her, her arms straining against the force of the river. The cub's fragile body felt weightless in her hands as she struggled to keep both of them from being swept away. She was nearly out of breath, her body fighting against the water. But Ruth didn't give up. She dug deep, recalling the strength that had carried her through countless challenges in life. With one final desperate pull, Ruth managed to haul the cub onto the muddy riverbank. Her heart pounded in her chest, her body aching from the effort. But she had done it. The little cub lay there, gasping for air, his tiny chest heaving. Ruth's hands trembled as she gently stroked his fur, trying to reassure him. For a moment, all was silent except the sound of their breaths and the distant calls of birds. Ruth watched as the cub's breathing slowed, and he began to stir. His fur was matted and wet, his small form shivering, but he was alive. Ruth let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding, her body sinking to the ground beside him. Her legs trembled from the effort, but she didn't care. She had saved him. She had done the impossible. The cub turned his head to look at her, and Ruth's heart swelled with a deep, emotional connection. She had rescued him, yes, but it felt as though something more profound had passed between them. It was as if he trusted her with his life, and now they were bound together by something unspoken but real. But Ruth knew this was just the beginning. She had no idea what lay ahead, but one thing was certain. This was a moment that would change both of their lives forever. The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows across the savannah as Ruth carried the exhausted lion cub back to her small, humble home on the edge of the village. The cub, no more than a few months old, was nestled in her arms, his small body shaking from both the cold and the trauma of his near drowning. Ruth's breath came in short, heavy bursts as she trudged through the dry earth, her muscles sore from the effort of rescuing the cub. She had no idea what would come next, but she knew one thing for certain. This little lion, this helpless creature, had been entrusted to her care. As she reached her home, Ruth gently laid the cub on a bed of straw in her small shed, the same place where she had nursed countless injured animals back to health over the years. She covered him with an old woolen blanket, her hands moving with the care and tenderness of someone who had known loss and love in equal measure. She had seen animals come and go throughout her life, but this cub, this tiny, vulnerable creature, felt different. The cub stirred in his sleep, a soft, pitiful whimper escaping from his throat. Ruth leaned down, placing a gentle hand on his back, her fingers feeling the warmth of his small body beneath the blanket. She couldn't help but wonder how he had ended up alone in the wild, struggling to survive. Had he been abandoned by his pride, or had something worse happened? Ruth's mind raced as she recalled the rumors she had heard in the village about a pride of lions being pushed out of their territory due to a surge in human activity in the area. Could this cub be the last of his pride, left behind in the wake of human interference? It was a tragic thought, and Ruth felt the weight of it settle in her chest. She had always been a protector of wildlife, but there was something about this little lion that made her heart ache. The hours passed, and the sky outside darkened as a cool evening breeze began to sweep across the savannah. Ruth sat by the cub, keeping watch as he slept fitfully. She knew the challenges ahead would be immense. A lion cub raised without the protection and guidance of his mother would struggle to survive in the wild. He would need food, shelter, and care, things that Ruth could provide, but only for a time. The cub would eventually need to learn the ways of his kind, the survival skills that would allow him to thrive in the harsh world of the savannah. But for now, Ruth focused on keeping him alive, on giving him a chance to recover from the trauma he had endured. She couldn't bear the thought of losing him. As the night wore on, Ruth began to prepare a meal for herself, her mind still preoccupied with the little cub. She had learned from years of experience that when an animal was hurt or frightened, the best thing to do was to keep calm, to provide a sense of safety and stability. She had dealt with the injured and the lost before, but this was different. This was a lion, a creature of immense power and beauty, a creature that could one day become a symbol of strength, resilience, and freedom. But for now, he was a helpless, trembling cub in need of love and care. Ruth's thoughts were interrupted by a soft rustling from the corner of the room. She looked over to see the cub's eyes fluttering open. Slowly, he lifted his head, his golden eyes blinking in confusion as he took in his new surroundings. Ruth smiled softly and stood up, moving closer to him. She crouched down beside him, her hand gently stroking his fur. "Hey there," she whispered, her voice warm and soothing. "You're safe now." The cub blinked at her, his ears flicking back as he seemed to assess her presence. Ruth's heart swelled as she gazed into his eyes. There was a quiet intelligence there, a spark of understanding that told her he wasn't just an animal. He was a soul, a creature with a story of his own. But despite the connection she felt, Ruth knew this wasn't going to be easy. She had heard the stories of how lions raised in captivity or by humans often struggled to adapt to life in the wild. They lost their instincts, their connection to the land. But the thought of leaving him here, to die alone in the wilderness, was unimaginable. She had to help him. She had to give him a chance. The following days passed in a blur of routine. Ruth spent every waking moment caring for the cub. She fed him a mixture of milk and meat, something she had learned from years of caring for orphan wildlife. She made sure to bathe him, keeping him clean and comfortable. Each day, the cub grew stronger, his eyes more alert, his movements less sluggish. He began to explore the small shed, sniffing around, finding his way through the narrow spaces. It was as though he was learning to trust again, learning that not all humans were a threat, that there was kindness in the world. But Ruth knew that it couldn't last forever. As the cub grew stronger, he would need to be introduced to the wild again, to the land where he truly belonged. The thought of releasing him back into the savannah was daunting, but it was the only choice. She could only offer him safety and love for so long before the wild would call him back. One evening, as Ruth sat outside the shed, the cub curled up at her feet. She felt a sense of peace wash over her. The sunset painted the sky in brilliant shades of orange and pink, and for a moment, everything felt right in the world. But as the cub let out a soft growl in his sleep, Ruth's thoughts turned to the future. She had given him a chance, but there was still so much unknown. The bond between them had deepened over these days. It was clear that this little cub had touched Ruth's heart in a way she never expected. She couldn't help but wonder if, just maybe, their paths had crossed for a reason. In his eyes, she saw something that reminded her of herself. A survivor, a fighter, someone who had been through hardship but had always found the strength to keep going. But even as Ruth pondered the future, a shadow loomed over them. A storm was coming, not just in the weather, but in the form of danger from outside forces, humans and wildlife alike. Ruth's decision would soon be tested, and she had no idea how it would unfold. Would she be able to let go of the cub when the time came, or would her love for him keep her from doing what was best for him? As the days stretched into weeks, Ruth's bond with the lion cub grew deeper. His golden eyes, once filled with confusion and fear, now sparkled with curiosity and affection. Each day brought small victories, a step forward in the cub's journey of healing. Ruth had named him Aslan, a tribute to the mighty lion from her favorite childhood stories. She had always believed that names had power, and Aslan's name was meant to give him strength, a name befitting the king of the jungle, even if he wasn't quite there yet. Ruth's life had always revolved around animals. She knew how to care for them, how to heal their wounds. But the thought of raising a lion cub from infancy was something she had never imagined. Aslan's needs were different from the goats and cattle she had raised over the years. His instincts were wild, untamed, and Ruth couldn't help but wonder if she was doing more harm than good. She had no doubt that she could nurture him physically, but emotionally, mentally, Ruth had no experience raising a lion. Her doubts grew as she watched him grow stronger every day. His once wobbly legs were now firm and graceful. His playful nature began to emerge, chasing after sticks and pouncing on imaginary prey. But there was something more, the wildness in his eyes, the primal instinct that came with being a lion. Ruth could see the struggle within him. He was torn between the safety of her care and the call of the wild. One afternoon, as Ruth was working in her garden, she heard a commotion from the direction of the shed. Her heart skipped a beat, and she immediately dropped the shovel in her hands. Aslan had been left alone, and she knew something wasn't right. Ruth rushed to the shed, her mind racing with possibilities. When she arrived, she found Aslan standing at the entrance, his body rigid with alertness. His ears were perked up, and his eyes were focused on something beyond the shed. Ruth followed his gaze, and her stomach twisted. A large male lion was standing in the distance, watching them. Ruth's breath caught in her throat. It was not uncommon for wild lions to wander into the area, especially with the pride's territory being so close. But seeing the male lion here, so close to the shed, was a different matter altogether. It wasn't just a passing encounter, it was a threat. Ruth had lived through enough encounters with wildlife to understand the dangers that came with it. But this was different. This was Aslan's future standing at the threshold. For a moment, Ruth was paralyzed. She knew that Aslan, despite all of her love and care, was still a wild animal, a creature that belonged to the savannah. And in that moment, the truth hit her harder than ever. She could no longer protect him from the world. The world that had always been his home was calling him back. But as Ruth took a step forward, she noticed something that shocked her to her core. Aslan, the cub who had clung to her for safety, was no longer afraid. His body was still, his eyes locked onto the male lion. He was not trembling with fear. He was standing tall, his body taut with curiosity, as though he was sizing up the situation. There was no panic in his stance, only an innate understanding of the wild that Ruth had never seen before. Ruth took another step forward, and that's when it happened. Aslan took a few cautious steps toward the male lion, his eyes never leaving the older lion's gaze. It was as if he was calling out to him, asking for something only he could understand. Ruth froze, unable to move, unable to speak. She could feel the gravity of the moment weighing on her. This wasn't just a cub trying to survive. It was a cub answering the call of his ancestors. The male lion, watching Aslan with a knowing look in his eyes, let out a low, rumbling growl. But it wasn't an aggressive growl. It was a sound of recognition. The lion slowly turned and walked away, disappearing into the tall grass as quickly as he had appeared. Ruth stood there, her heart pounding in her chest. She had witnessed something extraordinary. It was a moment that confirmed what she had been afraid of all along. Aslan was not just a pet. He was a lion, and the wild was in his blood. She couldn't protect him from this. She couldn't hold him back. As the sun began to set, Ruth sat beside Aslan, who now seemed more peaceful, as though he had made some kind of unspoken connection with the wild. The evening breeze stirred the air, and Ruth felt a deep sense of loss welling up inside her. She had always known this day would come, the day when Aslan would no longer need her to survive. But knowing it and living through it were two very different things. Ruth's mind was torn between the love she felt for this little lion and the reality of his nature. She had given him everything she could, a safe place, food, love. But was it enough? Was it enough to prepare him for the challenges that lay ahead? The world outside her small home was filled with dangers. The dangers of predators, harsh conditions, and, perhaps most troubling of all, humans who would stop at nothing to destroy the very creatures she had worked so hard to protect. Her thoughts were interrupted when Aslan nuzzled his head against her side, seeking comfort, his actions reminding her of how far they had come together. Ruth stroked his fur, her fingers trembling as she realized just how deeply she had come to care for him. She wasn't ready to let him go, but deep down, she knew it was inevitable. That night, as Ruth lay in bed, the weight of the decision pressed down on her. She knew what she had to do. It was time for Aslan to go back to where he belonged, the wild, his true home. But as she drifted off to sleep, the thought of sending him into the unknown made her heart ache. She had given him her love. The days following the encounter with the male lion were heavy with unspoken tension. Ruth couldn't shake the feeling that the cub, her Aslan, was no longer just a vulnerable creature in need of care. He had grown stronger, more aware of the world around him, and she couldn't ignore the truth any longer. The wild was calling to him, urging him to return to his roots. Aslan's behavior had changed over the past week. The once timid cub that clung to her for protection now exhibited a certain independence. He no longer looked to Ruth for comfort after a long day. Instead, he spent more time outside, exploring the vast land around the shed. He would climb the rocks near the river, sniffing the air with a sharpness that Ruth had never seen before. His body language spoke volumes. He was growing into a lion, a king in the making, and the call of the wild was loud in his heart. Ruth could see it in his eyes. There was a hunger for something more, something deeper than she could provide. It wasn't just food or shelter. It was freedom, the need to run, to hunt, to feel the earth beneath his paws and the wind in his fur. She had always known this day would come, but she hadn't expected it to feel this painful. One morning, Ruth awoke to find the shed empty. Panic surged through her as she rushed outside, calling for Aslan. The sun had barely risen, casting a soft golden light over the land. But the familiar sound of his small, playful growls was absent. Her heart hammered in her chest as she searched the area, the fear growing with every step. It wasn't long before she heard the faintest growl coming from the direction of the river. Her legs moved faster than her mind could process. Ruth's heart was in her throat as she rushed toward the sound, knowing deep down what she was about to face. When she reached the riverbank, she saw Aslan standing there, watching the water with a sense of calm determination. His tail flicked slowly, his eyes focused on something beyond the river. Ruth's breath caught in her throat as she stepped closer, her hands trembling. On the other side of the river stood a wild lioness, her golden coat blending seamlessly with the grass. She was observing Aslan with the same intensity that he had shown toward her earlier. It was clear that this was no random encounter. This was the moment Ruth had feared, the moment when Aslan's destiny would no longer be in her hands. The lioness growled low, a sound of recognition and challenge, and Ruth watched as Aslan responded in kind. His body was tense, but there was no fear in his stance. He didn't run to her for safety, as he would have done in the past. Instead, he stood his ground, a fierce defiance in his eyes. Ruth's heart broke as she realized the truth in that moment. Aslan was no longer the helpless cub she had saved. He was becoming a lion, and his future was calling him to this other world, one that was dangerous, untamed, and beyond her reach. Ruth's emotions swirled as she stepped back, out of Aslan's sight, not wanting to intrude on this pivotal moment. She knew that she couldn't make him stay. He had to make this choice himself. She had given him the best of her love and care, but now it was time for him to become who he was meant to be. The love she had for him was not enough to keep him from his destiny. Aslan took a step forward, his eyes still fixed on the lioness across the river. Ruth felt the finality of it, the inevitable departure that she had been dreading. She had known, deep in her heart, that the time would come when Aslan would have to return to the wild. But seeing it unfold before her, witnessing the cub she had saved become something else, something greater, was more painful than she could have ever imagined. The lioness took a few steps forward, and for a moment, it seemed as though time stood still. Aslan slowly stepped toward the river's edge, his body moving with a confidence that made Ruth's heart swell with pride and sorrow in equal measure. He looked back at her once, their eyes meeting for a brief moment, and in that glance, Ruth saw everything. She saw his gratitude for the life she had given him, and she saw the call of his blood, pulling him toward a future she could no longer be a part of. Then, without a sound, Aslan crossed the river. The lioness stepped aside, allowing him pass. The two lions stood side by side, their forms silhouetted against the rising sun. For a moment, Ruth thought she saw the lioness nuzzle Aslan gently, as if welcoming him home. Ruth could only watch, her heart aching with every passing second. She wanted to call out to him, to beg him to stay, but she knew better. She couldn't keep him tied to this small, human world. He was meant for something greater, something wild. And despite the pain, she knew this was the right thing to do. As the two lions disappeared into the tall grass, Ruth sank to her knees, tears streaming down her face. She had loved him like her own child, but now she had to let him go. It was the hardest thing she had ever done, but she knew that sometimes love meant sacrifice. She had given Aslan a chance to live, to survive, to thrive. Now, it was time for him to be free. As Ruth sat on the riverbank, the sun fully risen and casting its warm light over the land, she reflected on everything she had done for Aslan. She had taught him to trust, to love, to survive, and now she had taught him the most important lesson of all, freedom. Ruth woke the next morning to an empty shed. The usual sound of Aslan's playful growls and the rustling of straw as he shifted around were absent. Her heart skipped a beat, and for a moment, the fear and uncertainty from the day before threatened to overwhelm her. But as she stood up and walked to the doorway, she saw the unmistakable tracks in the dirt, paw prints leading toward the river. The world outside her small home was bathed in soft morning light, the land still quiet, the air fresh with the scent of dew. Ruth stepped into the cool morning, her bare feet brushing against the earth as she followed the tracks. Her heart ached with each step, knowing this was the day when she would have to say goodbye to Aslan, the lion cub she had raised, the cub she had fought to save, now standing at the threshold of his destiny. She reached the riverbank, where she had stood only the day before, and paused. The water was calm this morning, its surface reflecting the light in a peaceful, almost serene way. But the sight of the two lions, the cub she had nurtured and the lioness that had come for him, was already burned into her mind. Ruth had known that Aslan would return to the wild, but the reality of it hit her like a wave crashing against the rocks. It was one thing to know it intellectually, but it was another thing entirely to face it in the silence of the morning. As Ruth stood there, the breeze ruffled her hair, and she took in a deep breath. The sound of a twig snapping behind her startled her, and she quickly turned to see a shadow emerging from the tree line. It was Aslan, standing tall, his golden mane beginning to show as it grew, though he still had the youthful softness of his cubhood. He looked at her, his eyes soft but steady, the familiar recognition in his gaze. It was the same look he had given her when she first pulled him from the river, the same look that had been filled with fear and uncertainty. But now, there was something different. There was an understanding in his eyes, a quiet acknowledgement of what had to come next. Ruth's throat tightened as she crouched down, her heart swelling with emotion. "You've grown so much," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I never imagined I would be here, standing in front of you like this. But I'm proud of you. I'm proud of the lion you've become." Aslan didn't move closer, but he didn't move away either. He stood there, a mere few feet away, watching her with the same intensity he always had. But now there was a quiet strength behind his gaze. He had come to realize something Ruth had known from the very beginning, that he could never belong to the world of humans. His place was out there in the wild with his own kind. Ruth reached out and gently stroked the side of his face, her fingers grazing through his golden fur. She could feel the raw power in his muscles beneath the soft coat, the wild energy that pulsed through him. She had raised him, but in the end, it wasn't her love that would guide him. It was a call of his instincts, the heritage he had inherited from his ancestors. For a long time, the two of them stood in silence, the connection between them stronger than ever. Ruth had always believed that love was a two-way street, and in this moment, she felt the love Aslan had for her. It wasn't just gratitude or affection. It was something deeper, something more primal, a bond between a human and a wild animal that transcended words. But despite this connection, Ruth knew that it was time to let go. Aslan was not hers to keep. He was a creature of the wild, and he needed to be free. Aslan took a step back, and for the first time, Ruth saw something in his posture, a hesitation. It was as if he, too, understood what was happening. His wild instincts were pulling him back to his pride, to the life that awaited him. But the love and gratitude he felt for Ruth held him just a moment longer. The sound of the lioness's growl echoed from the distance, a low, throaty sound that called Aslan, reminding him of his purpose. Ruth's heart broke, but she knew what she had to do. "Go!" she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Go to them. You're ready. You've always been ready. I'll always love you, Aslan. Always." The cub, no, the young lion, took one last, lingering look at her, his golden eyes filled with something that could only be described as acknowledgement. It was a silent promise, one that Ruth could feel deep within her chest. And then, without another sound, Aslan turned and walked toward the river. Ruth stood there, watching him as he crossed the water. Each step seemed deliberate, as though he was saying goodbye in his own way. The lioness stood just across the river, watching him, waiting for him to join her. When Aslan finally reached her, the two lions turned toward the savannah, their powerful forms moving in sync as they disappeared into the tall grass. Ruth stayed where she was, her feet rooted to the earth. She wanted to run after him, to call his name one last time, but she knew better. She knew that he had to follow the call of his blood, the wild path that awaited him. She had given him the gift of life, and now it was time for him to live it fully. Tears streamed down Ruth's face, but a bittersweet smile tugged at the corners of her lips. She had raised Aslan, yes, but it wasn't just her love that had helped him survive. It was his strength, his courage, his connection to something far greater than any of them. The wild had called to him, and he had answered. Ruth took a deep breath, letting the cool morning air fill her lungs. She wasn't sure what the future held, but she knew this. She would always carry the memory of Aslan with her, in her heart and in the stories she would tell. The wild had claimed him, but she would always be his first protector, his first friend. And that, Ruth realized, was enough. The days after Aslan's departure felt heavy for Ruth. The quiet that filled her small home was suffocating. The absence of his playful growls, his curious footsteps, the thrum of his presence, leaving a hole in her heart that she didn't know how to fill. She spent her mornings tending to the garden, her evenings by the fire, but there was no true joy. Ruth was a woman who had spent her life in service to the animals she loved, but the bond she had shared with Aslan was different. It was unique. It was a bond born of survival, of shared moments, of a connection that transcended species. As Ruth walked through the village, she couldn't help but overhear the whispers, the talk about the cub that had been raised by a human, now gone. Some believed the story of her rescue was a myth, a story told to boost her reputation. Others thought the lion had left because it had simply outgrown its human caretaker. But Ruth knew the truth. Aslan hadn't just outgrown her. He had answered the call of his blood, the call of his ancestors of the wild. It was a calling that no human could ever truly understand, not even her. The world, Ruth realized, was full of moments like this, moments of sacrifice, of love, of letting go. She had given Aslan everything she could. She had loved him with all her heart. But the greatest gift she could give him was the one thing she feared the most: freedom. And even as her heart ached with the loss of him, Ruth knew that love, real love, was always about setting them free when the time came. One evening, a few weeks after Aslan had left, Ruth found herself sitting by the river, the same river where she had rescued him, the same river that had led him back to the wild. The moonlight glistened on the surface of the water, casting a silvery sheen across the land. Ruth closed her eyes and let the cool breeze wash over her, the sounds of the night filling her ears. And in that moment, she felt something she had not felt since his departure: peace. The peace that came from knowing she had done what was best for him. The peace that came from knowing he was free, that he was out there in the world where he belonged, living the life he was meant to live. A rustling in the grass behind her broke the silence, and Ruth turned, her heart skipping a beat. A figure emerged from the shadows, and for a moment, Ruth thought she was seeing things. It couldn't be. But as the figure stepped into the moonlight, there was no mistaking it. It was Aslan. He stood before her, taller than before, his golden mane now fully grown and flowing in the wind. His eyes locked with hers, and Ruth's breath caught in her throat. It was him, the lion she had raised, the cub she had loved, now standing before her as a magnificent creature of the wild. For a long moment, neither of them moved. It was as though time had stopped, as if the world itself was holding its breath. Aslan took a tentative step forward, his movements slow and deliberate. Ruth felt a surge of emotion rise within her, but she didn't speak. She didn't need to. Words were unnecessary. They both understood the moment. They understood the bond they shared. Aslan stopped just a few feet away from Ruth. His golden eyes, full of wisdom and strength, studied her, and for a brief, fleeting moment, Ruth saw the cub he had once been, the helpless creature she had pulled from the river. But now he was something more, something wild, something free. Ruth's heart swelled with pride as she looked into his eyes. She had done her part. She had given him the foundation he needed to survive, to thrive. But now it was his turn. He was a king in his own right, and the savannah was his kingdom. He no longer needed her protection. He was free. And yet, even in his newfound freedom, Ruth could see that the bond they had shared was not lost. Aslan took one more step forward, and to Ruth's amazement, he nuzzled her hand. It was a gesture of affection, of gratitude, of understanding. He remembered her. He remembered the love she had given him, the love that had allowed him to survive, to become the lion he was meant to be. Ruth placed her hand on his massive head, her fingers running through his golden mane. The feeling of his fur beneath her touch was a bittersweet reminder of the journey they had shared. She had watched him grow, and now She was witnessing his true form, his true purpose. Aslan stepped back, giving Ruth one last look, his eyes filled with silent understanding. He turned then, his powerful body moving gracefully as he disappeared into the tall grass. Ruth watched him go, her heart heavy but full of love. The wind picked up, carrying the sound of distant lions' roars through the air. Aslan's pride was calling to him, urging him forward. And Ruth knew, deep in her soul, that he was where he was meant to be. As the sounds of savannah filled the night, Ruth sat by the river, her eyes fixed on the horizon. She had given Aslan everything she could, her love, her care, and most of all, her freedom. And now, it was time for her to move forward, to carry his memory with her as a legacy of the love they had shared. The wild was where he belonged, but a part of him would always be with her, and Ruth smiled through her tears, knowing that the journey they had shared would never truly end. Aslan had become a lion, but in her heart, he would always be her cub. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, leave a like, and turn on notifications. Share this story with someone who believes in the power of love, freedom, and the bond between humans and animals. Thank you for following Aslan's journey. His story is a testament to the resilience, courage, and love that connects all living beings.